Good morning. Today, Pastor Peter Chin will share the message from the book of Mark, chapter 2, verses 18 through 22. I'll read in Thai and Melanie will read in English. Hear the word of the Lord. ระหว่างที่พวกศิษย์ของยอห์นและพวกฟาริสีกำลังถืออดอาหารประชาชนมาทูลถามพระองค์ว่าทำไมพวกศิษย์ของยอห์นและพวกศิษย์ของฟาริสีถืออดอาหารแต่พวกสาวกของพระองค์ไม่ถือพระเยซูจึงตรัสกับพวกเขาว่าเพื่อนๆของเจ้าบ่าวควรอดอาหารขณะที่เจ้าบ่าวยังอยู่กับพวกเขาหรือเจ้าบ่าวอยู่ด้วยนานเท่าไหร่เพื่อนๆก็ไม่ควรอดอาหารนานเท่านั้นแต่มีเวลาที่เจ้าบ่าวจะถูกพรากจากพวกเขาในวันนั้นแหละที่พวกเขาจะถืออดอาหารไม่มีใครเอาท่อนผ้าพอดใหม่มาปะเสื้อเก่าถ้าทำอย่างนั้นท่อนผ้าทอใหม่ที่ปะเข้าไปจะทำให้เสื้อเก่าขาดกว้างออกไปอีกเมื่อมันหดและไม่มีใครเอาเหล้าองุ่นหมักใหม่มาใส่ไว้ในถุงหนังใหม่ถ้าทำอย่างนั้นหนังเหล้าองุ่นหมักใหม่จะทำให้ถุงขาดทั้งเหล้าองุ่นและถุงก็จะเสียไปด้วยกันแต่เหล้าองุ่นหมักใหม่จะต้องใส่ไว้ในถุงหนังใหม่
Now John's disciples and the Pharisees were fasting. Some people came and asked Jesus, "How is it that John's disciples and the disciples of the Pharisees were fasting, but yours are not?" Jesus answered, "How can the guests of the bridegroom fast while he is with them? They cannot, so long as they have him with them. But the time will come when the bridegroom will be taken from them, and on that day they will fast. No one sews a patch of unshrunk cloth to an old garment, otherwise the new garment will pull away from the old, making the tear worse. And no one pours new wine into old wineskins, otherwise the wine will burst the skins, and both the wine and the wineskins will be ruined. No, they pour new wine into new wineskins." This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God. Such a full service already, but I want to close with hopefully what will be a fairly brief but insightful word for you all. This is the first Sunday of 2021. It is a new year. Thank God that we got through 2020. We're praying that 2021 will be more normal, more healthy for all of us. Given that it is a new year, I wanted to preach kind of a New Year sermon. And I think the illustration from the Bible that is very often used during this time of year is the wineskins, that wineskins illustration. And that comes from Mark chapter 2, verse 22, where it reads this: "And no one pours new wine into old wineskins. Otherwise, the wine will burst the skins, and both the wine and the wineskins will be ruined. No, they pour new wine into new wineskins." Now, growing up, I had no idea what Jesus was talking about. I read this passage, and there's just these passages in Scripture, you read them, and you're kind of like, okay, I'm skipping over this. I'm going to something else I understand a little better. That was the wineskins passage for me. But as I began to learn what he's actually talking about, this illustration makes a lot of sense. It's not nonsense. It's actually very, very insightful. And more than just being insightful, it actually teaches us some really important things. So I very briefly wanted to explain what Jesus is talking about. And it has something to do with how wine was and is made. If you know anything about wine, wine traditionally is made by crushing grapes, where you crush grapes by foot. And it's not the same thing ultimately as grape juice, though, because what happens with that grape juice that gets created, it mixes with substances on the surface of the grape skin. And that substance, when they're mixed together, they would pour that into a hide or leather wineskin to begin to ferment. And the product of that fermentation process is alcohol. That grape juice, mixed together with that substance from the skin of the grape, would ferment and become alcoholic. It would become wine at the end of it. The other byproduct of that fermentation process is actually gas. A lot of gas gets produced. So as that grape juice begins to transform, it actually begins to puff out the wine skin, so it becomes like a balloon and gets all stretched out. And by the end of it, they would pour out this grape juice, and lo and behold, it had become wine as a result of that process. So that's how they would make wine back in that time period. But what they would do afterwards is they would have a new harvest of wine in the next season. And let's say they took that new wine that had just been crushed and they poured it into that old wineskin that had already been stretched out. It begins to create alcohol, but also a lot of gas. But the problem is that the wineskin had already been stretched out the previous season, had already gone out to as far as it can go, and so it can't stretch out anymore, and so it would burst. And because it burst, that harvest of wine would be lost as well as the wineskin itself. So this is what Jesus is talking about. He's saying that new wine needs to go into a new wineskin so it can grow and expand and it won't burst as a result. Because if you put new wine into an old wineskin, it has nowhere to go. It can't stretch with that new wine. So there's actually a real logic, an explanation, a historical, scientific explanation as to what this illustration that Jesus is teaching. But there's deeper levels of insight to this, because on one level, Jesus is really talking about himself. That Jesus himself is that new wine that will require a new understanding of God, self, and others. So part of this new wine that Jesus is referring to is himself. He is this new wine that God is pouring out that will stretch and change everything. Jesus will change our understanding of who God is and how God feels about us. Jesus will change our relationship to God and who we are to God in this fundamental way. Jesus will change how we treat one another. All the wineskins that we have will change as a result of Jesus. So Jesus himself is that new wine. That's part of what he is saying here. But there's also a very personal and practical dimension to what we can take away from the wineskins teaching, which is this. When God pours new wine into our lives, we need new wineskins, attitudes, behaviors, and practices to be able to grow and to mature with that new wine. There will be seasons in our lives where God is doing something new. He is pouring out new wine. It might be a new conviction, a new season, a new job, a new relationship, but there is something new that God is breathing and pouring into our lives. And unfortunately, our habit is that we take that new wine, but we cram it into our old wineskins, into our old lives, everything being exactly as it was before, the same behaviors, the same attitudes, the same relationships, and we expect everything to be fine. We expect that new thing that God is doing to grow and mature into our old life, and it doesn't happen because there's no room. Our lives cannot grow with this new thing that God is doing. If God is going to pour new wine into our lives, then we need to prepare new wineskins to grow with that new thing, with that new conviction, with that new season that God has given us. The structures and the habits of our life have to grow so that it can mature with that new thing that God is doing. And so that brings about a question that we can ask ourselves, what I'll call the wineskin question. What new wine is God pouring into your life, and what new wineskins do you need in order to grow and mature with that new wine? What new thing is God doing? Is it a new teaching, a new season, a new time of your life? What is that new wine? But we can't just stop with saying this is the new thing that God is doing, because it needs a new wineskin. It needs something in our lives to be able to flex and to grow with whatever conviction God has given us. And so with whatever new wine is given, we have to ask the question, what is my new wineskin? How will my life and my practices and my relationships change to grow with this new thing God is doing? So this by itself, this illustration is very powerful and very insightful. It's why we preach it on New Year's. But there's actually a deeper truth to this passage. And it comes about when we remember this is not just about wineskins. Very often I've heard this preached as if that were the whole passage. The whole passage is about wineskins. But if you remember, this is actually just one of 3 illustrations that Jesus gives us. There's a deeper truth that Jesus is teaching here that goes beyond wineskins. And it goes back to the question that was asked at the very beginning. In verse 18, it reads this: Now John's disciples and the Pharisees were fasting. Some people came and asked Jesus, "How is it that John's disciples and the disciples of the Pharisees are fasting, but yours are not?" This is the initial context of this passage. It's about spiritual practices. Hey, John's disciples fast, the Pharisees fast, why don't you fast? Now, we might imagine in that whole wineskins, out with the old wineskin, in with the new wineskin thing, that given that's what this passage is about, Jesus' response would be, I'm the new wine, and we need new wineskins. You don't need fasting anymore. That's old school. That's Old Testament stuff. You don't need that. You just need the new things instead. It's actually not what he says. He begins with an illustration about relationships. And he says this: How can the guests of the bridegroom fast while he is with them? They cannot, so long as they have him with them. But the time will come when the bridegroom will be taken from them, and on that day they will fast. Essentially, in his explanation, what he is saying here is, he's saying, hey, let's say a friend comes to town because he's getting married, or she is getting married. What do you do with that friend? Do you kind of go in your room and you don't spend any time with them? You fast together? Is that what it is? No. Because of that person, because of the moment that's happening, you celebrate and you rejoice. That's what's appropriate and fitting when the bridegroom is there. But let's say you lose that person. Let's say that person is taken away from you. Then it'd be appropriate to be alone. Then it'd be appropriate to fast and to mourn, right? And essentially he's talking about himself, that he is that bridegroom who is with his disciples, and so they rejoice, but he will be taken away, and then they will mourn. But on a larger level, we have to understand that he doesn't say that fasting is bad. He doesn't say fasting is old school, an old wineskin, you don't do that anymore. He's saying that there is a time to fast when it's appropriate, and there's a time when fasting is not appropriate. That's really the context that he's talking about here. He's not throwing away an old practice. He's just saying that some practices are more fitting for other points in time. This is further reinforced by the next illustration, which is about cloth. In verse 21, he says this: No one sews a patch of unshrunk cloth on an old garment. Otherwise, the new piece will pull away from the old, making the tear worse. With the wineskins, what we heard was you need a new wineskin to stretch and to grow with new wine. But here, he's actually saying the opposite. He's saying for an old garment, to patch an old garment, you need old cloth. An old cloth that has already been stretched, it's already been shrunk, it's already been through the wash a few times, so that you can mend that garment and it won't shrink away and make everything worse. So he doesn't say you always need new stuff. He doesn't say if you have a hole in your garment, buy a new garment. He says find an old patch that can mend that appropriately, because that's what you really need. So you see here, the point of this passage is a little different from what we think. The context of this passage isn't how new things are better than old. It's about finding the appropriate practices for the appropriate seasons. That's really what he's teaching here. He's saying, if you have new wine, yes, you will need a new wineskin. But if you have a gaping hole in your life, you need an old patch. You need something that's tried and tested to fix that. Some of you are in a time of rejoicing. You need to rejoice. Some of you are in a time of fasting. He doesn't say always rejoice and always do the new things, always new wineskins. He's saying you need to know what you should be doing in the season that you're in. This passage is about fittedness. It's about what's appropriate, not simply what's about new. We have this fixation on the new. We have an addiction to new and novel things, so we only see the wineskins, and we're only thinking about the new things. That's not what Jesus is teaching here. Jesus is instructing us to know where we are and to know what tools we need, whether they are old or new ones. And that changes, I think, the real question that comes out of this passage. The question that we usually ask ourselves is, what new thing is God doing, and what new things do I have to do as a result? But I think the deeper question that Jesus is really asking, when you bring all the illustrations together, not just one of them, is this: do you know what season God has placed you in, And what is God calling you to do in that season, whether an old practice or a new one? This is the real question. It's not just about what new stuff God is doing and what new practices do I need. It's about self-knowledge. It's about knowing where we are and where God has placed us. It's about being open to whatever tools we need for that season. Some of them might be new. Some of them might be old. Some of them might be rejoicing. Some of them might be repenting. And so it's a different, deeper, and more nuanced question that Jesus is really asking us, but it's a harder one because of our fixation on new things. Because as a society, especially in Western American culture, we are always stampeding towards what is new. The 2021 model, the new dieting phase, the new practice, the new technology that's going to solve all of our problems. You go on the news right now, and that's everything that you'll hear. You hear about, you should be eating meat. No, don't eat any meat. There's this new thing that's happening. There's this new book. There's this new way to clean your house that's going to fix everything. We have this eternal addiction to new and novel things as being the solution, the panacea for all that we need. And because of that, this deeper question is very difficult for us to engage in. This deeper practice of self-knowledge that Jesus tells us to engage in is not natural. It is very unnatural for us. There are 3 shifts that I think we need to make in order to really begin to engage in this deeper practice, in this deeper spirituality that Jesus is calling us into. The first transition I think we need to make mentally is this: going from, do I know about that new thing I need to fix everything, to, do I know what season I am in and where God has placed me? As consumers, our first instinct is to consume, is to look for the new thing, the new practice, the new book, the new whatever it might be. And that is our first instinct. Whenever there's an issue or a problem, is to go and say, okay, what can fix it? What's going to fix it? And I often, when we kind of talk to one another, we're often trying to fix one another and give suggestions as to how we can fix things. It's just part of who we are. And so oftentimes in these seasons, especially in the new year, we're charging ahead forcefully and thinking about what is the new thing that's out there for us. But the first thing that we are advised to do in this passage is to ask the question, where are you? Do you even know what season you're in? Because if you don't know what season you're in, and you don't know what God is doing, how do you know what tool you're going to need? If you don't know what place you are in, how do you know if you need a wineskin or you need an old cloth? How do you know if you should be rejoicing and mourning if you don't know yourself? And so from this passage, we are given a different first step. That the first step is not to turn to the New York Times bestseller list and to CNN to see what new dieting craze is out there, but to look inside ourselves and to take a moment, not of consumption, but of self-introspection, of self-knowledge, and to know where we are so that we would better know what we really need. So that's one thing I think we need to fix, is not immediately charging out for new things, but starting off with asking and knowing where we are and where we've been placed. The second transition I think we have to make to really engage with this deeper spirituality is to go from, I need what that person has, or why isn't that person doing what I'll be doing, to a mentality where we say, God has placed that person in a different season from me, and so they have different needs. Think back to the initial context of this entire passage. Why did this conversation even take place? It's because of comparison, right? That people come and they are comparing Jesus and his disciples to other people. And they're saying, hey, John's disciples fast. Even the Pharisees fast. That's what spiritual people do. Why aren't you fasting? It's a comparison of why wouldn't you do these things that are what spiritually mature prophets and teachers would do. And Jesus' response is about, ask yourself what's fitting. Whether it's the appropriate thing to do, not whether someone else is doing it, not what John's doing and the Pharisees doing. Ask yourself, is this the time to be doing it? And I think it is so appropriate and important that we hear this as well. Because so often, our own spiritual life and our own spiritual practices are completely undercut by our tendency to compare ourselves to other people constantly. Whenever we're engaged with something, whenever we feel a calling, we immediately look to our right and our left, and we look at where other people are, and we gauge whether we are doing the right or the wrong thing based on them. We can do this with a spirit of envy. We look to someone and say, man, their life is so good. What are they doing? Like spiritual Pilates? Is it CrossFit? I got to do what they're doing because they are really doing incredibly well. Regardless if they don't have the same life as you, they don't have the same story, they don't live in the same area or whatever it might be, we try to take their gifts and whatever they are and place it upon our lives. In the same way, we do that in judgment to other people. We look at other people and we say, why aren't they doing what I'm doing? Because that's not what a spiritually mature person should do. That's not what I'm doing. They're doing something really strange. And so in both respects, our own engagement with our lives and with where we are and what God calls us to do is being circumvented and being hurt by our constant comparison to other people. Oh, I should be doing this, even though their life is different. I need new wineskins like they have, even though I'm in an old patch season, even though I need to fix this hole instead. Oh, this person should be doing that. Even though they're in a different season, maybe that is what they need to do. This passage tells us to stop doing that. It tells us to recognize that every person's season is different. And that, yes, maybe this other person is in a new wineskin season and they are growing and they're trying to find new wineskins for the new wine that they are given. But that may not be where you are. You might be in an old patch season where you need to mend a hole. And if you take that person's new wineskin that is stretchy and it's going to shrink and it's going to grow and you try to patch it onto your life, it's going to make it worse because that's not appropriate. It's not what you need. You need to know what you need and what God has placed in your life, not what someone else has placed in their life. And so it calls us to pay attention to where we are, to encourage those who are around us, yes, but not to compare. Another important practice there. The third shift that I think we need to make is going from saying, my old wineskins are useless, to my old wineskins were useful. It's a subtle distinction, but let me explain what I mean by that. We are such consumers that not only do we love new things, we love the newest thing that's out there, but as a result of that, we tend to despise the old. It's not just that we say, oh, we like new cars and new dieting things and new books and all this different stuff. We then turn around because of this affection, this addiction to the new, and we look to the old and we say, that's old. We know no one does that anymore. Consumers have to do that, right? If we don't despise the old and we embrace it and we're like, yeah, this is awesome still, we would never get the new things. And so we have this dual tendency of saying, yes, new things, but also, old things. That looks so old, played out. No one does that anymore, and we kind of ridicule and despise the old at the same time. But in this passage, we're given a different mentality because Jesus doesn't hate fasting. As he responds to these people, he doesn't say, because fasting stinks. Fasting is what Pharisees do. Fasting is what the old school do. They don't understand fasting. What does he say instead? He says fasting has a place in a season. And so he gives it value. He retains its value. He's just asking the question, is it appropriate at this time period? And so that's Jesus' mentality. Not to despise old practices, but to ask whether they're fitting or appropriate. And to acknowledge that they do have its places, that there will be times where you fast and you will have to fast. So you don't want to hate fasting because you may have to do that again. I think that's a really important distinction, a really important transition we have to make to going from a place where we say, oh yeah, this new thing is so great, and we despise the old, to instead say, this old thing had value. It was important. It may not be important now, but it had value. And in fact, I may have to use it again. I may have to go back to that thing again because there might be a season where I will need it again as well. And there's a certain context in which I think this is really important, and I really want people to hear that. And it's with people who are falling away from their faith because of a disconnect from their past. I've heard this multiple times from people that there are many people out there who feel like they are just holding on by their fingertips to their faith, that they are falling away from Jesus. But it's for a very interesting reason. It's not because of theology. It's not because they don't love Jesus, they don't follow after him, and they don't want to. It's because of their past. Because many of these people grew up in church, and all their friends were from church, and they steeped themselves in church, and they were going to church 8 days a week, and they were all in it. And that was all that they knew for so much of their lives. But now that experience and that part of their faith makes no sense. There is no connection to that part of their faith story. And in fact, there's not just a disconnect. There is disappointment, and there is disillusionment, and there is pain and hurt and loss, that they look at this place that they came from, and they can't help but feel kind of a disdain or a sense of, I don't understand these people. I don't understand what they're doing. I don't understand why they would say that. I don't understand anything that they do. And so there is this tragic loss of an entire part of their life. Family members, mentors, people that they spent all of their childhood with. And this is what their spiritual life looks like. Their life of faith looks like where they are now, and then the Grand Canyon away is where they used to be. And this is what is causing their faith to fracture, is because their life is fractured. Because they can't reconcile one season to the next. And so they're like a person with one foot in two different boats, just slowly but surely being separated and split apart. And I hear that over and over. And I know as I describe that, I'm describing some of you. Some of you feel like you are losing your faith because you cannot understand where you came from. And you cannot understand if that was all fake, and it was all just emotionalism, it was a cult maybe, and you don't know how that has any bearing on where you are now. This passage, I think, is really helpful, because what it tells us is that something may not be fitting for you any longer. It may not be something that you need anymore, but it still had value in one point in time in your life. No, where you were, that's no longer going to fit. It's no longer appropriate. You need a new wineskin, absolutely. But you don't need to hate the old wineskin. And you can say, yeah, it's different, and I can't be there anymore. I can't be there in a healthy way, but I do want to acknowledge that it's what I needed. God used that to bring me into faith. Was it perfect? No. Is where I am perfect? No. And we can lovingly put away that old wineskin. We don't need to rip it to shreds and to toss it away and so toss away a decent portion of our lives. We can treasure an old wineskin even as we put it away and put it on the shelf. And maybe some of us need to do that. Some of us, instead of just throwing away the past, need to say that that past is no longer what we need, but it did have a purpose. It did bring me to faith. It did bring me to this place. And I love it even as I put it away. This was a beautiful wineskin, but it's old and it's stretched out. And so we can put it on the shelf and love it from there. And as we do that, we can reconcile different parts of our lives. We don't need to despise the past and so divorce one section of our life from the other. But this can become one story of God using different things to bring us closer and closer and yet even closer to Him. It reminds me of an interesting fad or craze, on the spirit of talking about fads or craze, and that's Marie Kondo and thanking items. I don't know if people are still talking about Marie Kondo, but she had this interesting practice where if you are trying to throw away something or give away something and you can't, then you should thank it. You should literally tell that shirt, you were a good shirt, I liked your shirt, but you can't fit me anymore. And so I'm going to give you away, and you give it away. And it's an interesting practice to talk to your shirts. There's a little bit kind of like Shintoism, interacting with inanimate objects there as well. But I like that idea of connecting ourselves to the past and to recognizing the value that something had, even if we don't use it anymore. And again, just an encouragement to those of us who are really struggling with our faith because we cannot understand where we came from, that we can treasure this thing even if it doesn't fit us anymore. And I hope that you'll be able to do that. With that, I do want us to engage in this new year, especially as we have this prayer and fasting time coming up, but not just with new wineskins. Engage with the deeper truth that Jesus is putting out there. Let's take time to discern what season God has placed us in. Don't just jump to what new thing, what new practice, what new wine. Know yourself. Know where God has led you. Secondly, let's figure out what the best practices and attitudes are for that season, new or old. Yes, maybe some of you need a new wineskin that you've never had before. Maybe some of you need an old patch. Maybe you need to go back to what you were doing to mend that hole. And thirdly, let's honor old wineskins, even if we no longer use them. We don't have to hate ourselves and where we were and the people who were a part of our lives just because they aren't what we need anymore. We can love them, treasure these precious people, these precious experiences, these precious wineskins as we put them away, even if we don't use them any longer. I hope that we'll engage with this deeper calling that Jesus has for us. Let's pray together. Dear God, we do want to acknowledge and confess that we do have something of an addiction to new things. We're always charging ahead for the newest things, the new project, what's coming up, what are we doing next? But here you tell us to do something different. Even though we see this as the new wineskins passage, it is really about the bridegroom. And what do we do at certain times? It's about the old cloth and how old cloth is what we need to mend old holes. Help us in the same way to know ourselves and to ask the question of what season we are in, and then to be open-minded about whatever tool it is that we need for that season, not simply the new versus the old, but the new and the old, the rejoicing and the mourning, whatever it might be. And God, lastly, if we are struggling to make sense of our past, help us to celebrate the old wineskins, even if we don't need them any longer. Help us to recognize that they had a beautiful and important place, even in their imperfections, even in their lack of perfection, that they had a role to play, so that we might bring the different parts of our lives together into one story, which is your story in our lives. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.